Imagine a man who could bend steel, not with his hands, but with his mind. A man who saw America not as 50 states, but as one giant railroad map, a network of power lines carrying the country's heartbeat. Now imagine that same man sitting in a silent room, his hands trembling, not from age, but from obsession. He's staring at a single piece of paper, a stock certificate worth millions. His empire is on the edge of collapse. And for the first time in his life, Edward Henry Harriman, the man Wall Street called the Iron Wizard, is afraid. It wasn't always like this. Once he was a quiet boy from a middle-class family in New York, too small to play sports, too average to stand out. But inside his silence lived something dangerous, a hunger to control. He wasn't chasing money for luxury. He wanted power, the kind that could move nations, not people.
And the railroads
were his battlefield. By the early 1900s, America's railroads were the arteries of the nation. Whoever owned them owned America. Carnegie ruled steel. Rockefeller ruled oil. And E.H. Harriman wanted to rule movement itself, but power doesn't come peacefully. To control the rails, Harriman would challenge some of the most ruthless men in history, J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and even the President of the United States. He would manipulate markets, spark financial wars, and nearly destroy America's entire railroad system, all in his pursuit of dominance. A man who saw chaos not as a warning, but as a weapon. Yet behind his cold ambition there was something deeper, a hidden fear. A fear that time would forget him, that he'd build the greatest empire in history, and die a ghost. Steam bursts. The screen fades to black. Because what Harriman was about to do would shake Wall Street, terrify the government, and nearly bring the nation's railroads to their knees. Soft pause. Would you risk destroying your country's future just to prove you were the smartest man alive? Tell me in the comments. Would you have taken that gamble? He wasn't born rich. Edward Henry Haramman was the fifth of 6 children, the son of a preacher who believed more in prayer than in profit. While other boys chased adventure, Edward chased silence. He would walk down to the Hudson River and stand near the train tracks, just watching the locomotives thunder past, eyes unblinking, as if trying to memorize every sound, every motion, every vibration of steel against steel. The trains spoke to him. They weren't just machines. They were power, organized, predictable, and unstoppable. While men were messy and emotional, the railroads followed order. And in that order, young Harriman found peace. But peace didn't last long. By his teens, his family's money was gone. His father died, leaving nothing but debt. At 15, Edward dropped out of school and found himself behind a desk at a Wall Street brokerage. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. He started at the bottom, running errands, taking orders, invisible to everyone around him. But the quiet ones, they're always watching. He studied every trade, every whisper, every rumor that moved a stock price. While others gambled, he calculated. While others celebrated, he waited. He had no charm, no friends, no mentors. Just a burning will to outthink every man in the room. And slowly, he did. In his early 20s, he made his first big play, buying a small stake in a struggling railroad company. Not much, but it was enough for him to sit at the table where the real games were played. And when he spoke, the room went silent. The same boy who once stood watching trains now spoke like a man who could command them. He was cold, ruthless, brilliant. He didn't care if people liked him. He only cared about being right. By the time he was 30, he was quietly rich, not through luck, but through patience and precision. And deep inside, the boy who once stared at the tracks had already made his decision. He wouldn't just ride the railroads. He would own them, but to do that, he'd need to fight the kings of capitalism themselves, men who'd built America, men who'd destroy him without blinking. Cue the faint roar of thunder and the hiss of an approaching storm. Because Harriman's next move wouldn't just test his intelligence, it would test his soul. Would you challenge the most powerful men in America, knowing they could crush you overnight? By 1890, the railroads were the veins of the nation. They carried not just goods, but dreams. Every barrel of oil, every ton of steel, every immigrant heading west moved on the rails. And those rails were ruled by a handful of titans, men who believed they were untouchable. That belief ended the day E.H. Harriman stepped onto the board of the Union Pacific Railroad. It was a dying company, bankrupt, bloated, and crawling with corruption. Wall Street had written it off. But Harriman saw what no one else could see, potential hidden beneath decay. He saw order waiting to be restored. He walked into Union Pacific headquarters like a surgeon entering an emergency room. No small talk, no smiles. Within weeks, he was firing executives, rewriting contracts, and reorganizing departments from the ground up. He didn't lead with words, he led with precision. Every move was surgical, ruthless, and exact. People hated him for it. They called him arrogant, soulless, mechanical. But slowly, the numbers began to change. The trains ran faster, the profits returned, and the dying railroad came back to life. Harriman's rise wasn't fueled by charm, it was fueled by control. He worked 16-hour days, barely ate, rarely smiled. He didn't waste a single word. And yet, behind those cold eyes was a storm of obsession. He wasn't building a railroad. He was building a machine that obeyed him, and he wasn't satisfied with Union Pacific. Not even close. In 1901, he made a move that would define his legend and nearly destroy him. He wanted the Northern Pacific Railroad, one of the most powerful lines in the country. But there was a problem. J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill, two giants of Wall Street, already controlled it. To most men, that was the end. To Harriman, it was the beginning of war. He quietly ordered his brokers to buy every available share of Northern Pacific stock, in secret. Day after day, he devoured the market like a predator in the shadows. No one knew. No one suspected. Until it was too late. When Morgan finally realized what was happening, the damage was done. The entire stock market went insane. Prices exploded overnight. Men screamed on Wall Street as fortunes vanished in minutes. And at the center of it all, calm, silent, unshaken, sat E.H. Harriman. He had triggered the greatest financial panic in modern history, the legendary Northern Pacific corner of 1901. He had won the war, but he had also started a fire that would nearly burn the entire country's railroad system to the ground. The sound of metal grinding. The light fades to black. Power had made him untouchable. But the next move would make him unforgettable. Would you keep going if victory meant watching the world burn? It started as a whisper. Then, like thunder rolling down Wall Street, panic took over. May 9th, 1901, the day the markets nearly collapsed. Men in suits flooded Broad Street, faces white with fear. Some clutched worthless stocks. Others just stared, a broken, ruined. Banks locked their doors. Brokers fainted from exhaustion. And high above them all, in a quiet Manhattan office, E.H. Harriman stood perfectly still, watching. His secret gamble for control of the Northern Pacific Railroad had spiraled into madness. As he and J.P. Morgan fought in the shadows, the price of Northern Pacific stock exploded from $150 to $1,000 a share but in a single day. People sold everything to buy a piece. Those who couldn't afford it were crushed. Lives ended. Fortunes vanished. America's railroads, the foundation of the economy, were seconds away from collapsing, and Harriman, he didn't blink. He had no interest in chaos. He wanted control. But control, he learned that day, comes with a cost. Reporters called it the Great Northern Panic. Politicians called it reckless greed, but the truth was colder. It was the collision of titans, a war of intelligence, pride, and ego. Behind closed doors, Harriman and Morgan faced each other like chess masters locked in stalemate. Morgan, the banker who believed in order through cooperation. Harriman, the strategist who believed in domination through force. The tension between them wasn't just financial. It was philosophical. Two men trying to define how America would be run, by trust or by conquest. After 3 days of turmoil, the unthinkable happened. The two enemies struck a truce. They divided the spoils of the railroad world and called it peace. But Harriman didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just looked out his office window at the smoke rising from the chaos below and whispered to his assistant, "Next time, we'll do it differently." That night, he didn't go home. He stayed at his desk, sleeves rolled up, eyes hollow, because he wasn't finished. He wasn't built to stop. For Harriman, the panic wasn't a warning. It was a test, and he had passed it. He had seen the power of his own mind, the ability to bend an entire economy to his will. But as history would soon show, the same force that made him unstoppable would also become his undoing. The screen fades to black, leaving only the echo of a train whistle cutting through the silence. If your brilliance caused the world to burn, could you live with it? E.H. Harriman was no longer the silent observer. He was the king, the man who commanded more miles of railroad than anyone alive. Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, thousands of miles of iron veins pulsing across America. But power never satisfies a man who craves control. And Harriman's obsession was growing darker. He looked at the map of America and saw not 50 states, but a single organism. He believed he could build a network so efficient, so perfectly designed, that every train, every shipment, every movement of goods would follow one rhythm. His. To him, chaos was waste. Disorder was weakness. He wanted perfection. And to build it, he had to break everything first. So he made his most dangerous move yet. He tried to merge his empire into one colossal system, a single railroad trust that would control almost every western line in America. It was a plan so vast that even Wall Street trembled. To supporters, he was a visionary, the man who could make America run like a clock. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a man trying to turn the country into his personal monopoly, and soon one of those enemies came knocking, President Theodore Roosevelt. The two men couldn't have been more different. Roosevelt was loud, passionate, and idealistic, a fighter for the common man. Harriman was cold, calculating, and silent, a man who moved in shadows. When Roosevelt discovered Harriman's secret consolidation, he was furious. He ordered a federal investigation, accusing Harriman of trying to strangle competition and control the nation's infrastructure. To Roosevelt, Harriman wasn't a businessman. He was a threat to democracy itself. But Harriman didn't back down. He wrote Roosevelt a letter, long, restrained, and venomous beneath the ink. He told the president, "If this country is going to be ruled by popular passion, then God help us." It was more than defiance. It was prophecy. He was betting his life's work and his legacy against the full power of the U.S. government. And he knew exactly what that meant. The newspapers turned on him. The public began to despise him. He became a symbol of greed, control, and arrogance, the face of the man who wanted to own America. But to Harriman, it wasn't about greed. It was about design. He wasn't trying to steal the country's rails. He was trying to perfect them. Still, history doesn't remember intentions. It remembers the consequences, and the consequence of his gamble was isolation. He had everything he'd ever wanted, and no one left beside him. The boardrooms that once feared him now whispered his name with pity. He had won the empire, but he had lost the world. The sound of the pocket watch fades. A train horn echoes in the distance. Would you risk everything? Reputation? Power? Even your country's trust, just to prove your vision was right? He had conquered the rails. He had bent Wall Street to his will. He had faced presidents, outsmarted bankers, and ruled an empire of steel. But now, his empire was too heavy to carry. By 1909, Edward Harriman was dying, exhaustion, stress, a body breaking under the weight of brilliance. His eyes, once sharp enough to spot weakness across a table, had grown distant. He spent long hours in silence, staring out train windows, watching the country he'd helped build fly past him like a film reel. He wasn't yet 62, but he looked older than the mountains his trains cut through. Doctors begged him to rest. His wife, Mary, pleaded for him to stop working. But he couldn't. To Harriman, stopping meant failing. His life had never been about happiness. It had been about control. And control was the only thing keeping him alive. He spent his final months racing against time, finishing unfinished lines, reviewing schedules, perfecting routes. Each night he would collapse in his chair, coughing, eyes half closed, whispering to his secretary, "We're almost there. Just a little more order, a little more time." But time was no longer listening. The newspapers that once feared him now pitied him. They called him a dying emperor of iron and smoke. Yet even then, even as his hands trembled, he refused to let go of the telegraph that connected him to his empire. His last journey wasn't on a train he owned, it was in one. He travelled west to his estate in Arden, New York, his sanctuary in the woods. Witnesses said he spent his final evening looking out across the valley, watching the smoke from a distant locomotive rise through the autumn air. He whispered something only his son could hear. "Keep it running! Don't let it stop!" And then quietly, as the sun set over his empire, E.H. Harriman, the man who tried to control the very rhythm of a nation, lost control of his own heartbeat. The piano fades into silence. The camera lingers on the empty track, stretching endlessly into the horizon. He had built the mightiest railroad empire in history, but in the end, no man can outrun the train of time. Would you have lived the same way, knowing genius might cost you everything? E.H. Harriman's death should have ended his story, but it didn't, because his fingerprints were everywhere. Every major railroad stretching from the Great Plains to the Pacific carried a piece of his design. Every train that thundered across the West ran on rails he had modernized, funded, or fought for. The very rhythm of America, the commerce, the movement, the speed still pulsed with his order. The man who nearly destroyed America's railroads also rebuilt them. He left behind not chaos, but structure. Not ruin, but rhythm. He had forced the railroad industry, bloated and corrupt, to evolve or die. His methods were brutal, yes. His motives complex, but his results undeniable. And the irony? The same public that once called him a tyrant would later travel safely and efficiently because of his vision. He never wanted fame. He never sought applause. He wanted precision. A world where everything moved the way he thought it should. After his death, his son, Averell Harriman, carried the torch, turning his father's empire into one of the most powerful families in America. The Harriman name would echo through history, in railroads, in banking, even in politics, but none of it matched the sheer force of the man who built the foundation. To this day, historians debate who Harriman really was. A savior, a tyrant? A man who tamed the chaos of the rails? Or one who almost destroyed them trying to? Maybe. He was both. He was the embodiment of America's industrial soul. Restless, hungry, and unyielding. He lived for the chase, not the comfort. And in that, perhaps, he revealed a truth about human ambition itself. Because Harriman didn't want to own the world, he wanted to perfect it. And perfection is a prison that no man escapes. The camera pans over a deserted rail yard at dusk. The faint sound of a train in the distance grows louder, echoing like a ghost of his empire. He's gone, but his rails are still alive. Each train that passes in the night, each whistle that cuts through the wind, carries his legacy forward, the man who tried to control America's movement. Still moves it. Would you call that success? Or surrender? History remembers Edward H. Harriman as many things: a monopolist, a genius, a tyrant, a builder. But beneath all the titles was a man chasing one thing: control. He believed that if he could control movement, the flow of goods, of people, of time itself, he could create perfection. And in many ways, he did. His vision reshaped America's infrastructure, unified scattered rail systems, and gave order to an era drowning in greed and chaos. But what he couldn't control was the cost. He lost friends. He lost his health. He lost the peace he spent a lifetime searching for. Because obsession, even when disguised as genius, eventually devours its creator. And Harriman's story isn't just about railroads or wealth. It's about the human mind's endless war with itself, between ambition and surrender, creation and destruction, control and chaos. He wanted to build something eternal. Instead, he built something human, fragile, flawed, but unforgettable. When you look at a railroad today, those endless tracks vanishing into the horizon, remember this. They were carved not just by steel and labor, but by a man's belief that he could organize the world, and maybe that's what makes his story so powerful. Not the empire he built, not the millions he made, but the psychological price he paid to chase perfection in an imperfect world. Soft strings fade in. The camera pans from the tracks to the sunrise. Warm light stretching across the land Harriman once ruled. He died believing he could control America's heartbeat. But perhaps the truth is that America controlled his, because in the end, no matter how powerful, how rich, or how brilliant, every man faces the same moment. The train arrives, and time moves on. So I'll leave you with this question. If you had Harriman's mind, his drive, his hunger for mastery, but you knew it might destroy you, would you still chase it? Tell me in the comments. Would you have taken his path? Or stepped off the train, fade out? The whistle sounds one last time. Black screen. The title fades in. E. H. Harriman, the man who tried to control America's rails.